everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week, so if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then definitely subscribe. It's my current goal to get to 30,000 subscribers by my 21st birthday, which is the 12th of June. I don't know if it's going to be possible because I've got around 4,000 to go at the time that I'm filming this, so I don't know if it's going to be doable, but we can hope. I also read the other day in my YouTube analytics page that around 45% of the people who watch my videos aren't actually subscribed to my channel. So if you are watching this right now and you aren't subscribed and you like this kind of content and you'd like to see some more of it from me, then please do hit the subscribe button and also turn on the little notification bell, and then maybe we can make my goal of getting to 30k actually happen. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling. Today we are going to be talking about the solved case of Elizabeth Olten. Now, this case has been on my list for a while to cover and I finally got round to doing it. So this case happened in October of 2009 in St. Martin's, which is a city in Cole County in Missouri in the US. And I've literally just realised that last week's case, the case of Angela Hammond, also happened in Missouri. How did I not realise that? Sorry if you're from Missouri. 2 cases in a row from Missouri. I honestly did not realise until now that I had done that. I hope you guys don't mind. But anyway, this is Elizabeth Olten. She was a 9-year-old girl who obviously lived in St. Martin's in Missouri with her mother, whose name was Patty, and her 2 older siblings. She had an older brother named Anthony and an older sister named Stephanie. So Elizabeth was the youngest of 3 children. Now, I really couldn't find much information at all online about Elizabeth and her life and her personality, so I'm just going to get straight into the case. So it was Wednesday the 21st of October 2009, and that evening was just a normal evening for Elizabeth and her family. They were at home. Patty, her mother, was getting ready to cook dinner and Elizabeth was actually rehearsing. You see, she was going to be in a school play that was coming up, so she was just rehearsing her lines and practicing her little songs. And then around 5 p.m. that evening, there was a knock at the door. It was a 6-year-old little girl named Emma who lived about 4 houses down from Elizabeth and her family, I believe. And Emma knocked on the door and she asked 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten if she just wanted to come out and play for a little while. So Elizabeth asked her mother Patty if she could go out and play with Emma for a little while, and at first Patty just said no because obviously she was just about to make dinner and it was a school night. However, both of the girls were literally pleading with Patty. And so eventually Patty gave in to Elizabeth and she said, okay, you can go out and play for 1 hour, but you need to make sure that you're home by 6 p.m. And so Elizabeth agreed and she left with Emma. And that would be the last time that Patty ever saw her daughter again. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, Elizabeth still wasn't home, and Patty just instantly felt like something was wrong because it was due to be dropping dark soon, and Elizabeth was just absolutely terrified of the dark. She hated it, and so she would normally always be home before it got dark in the evenings. So Patty rang their neighbour's house, the house where that 6-year-old girl Emma lived. And Emma's grandmother, whose name was Karen, picked up the phone and Patty asked her, hi, is Elizabeth still at your house because she was meant to be home by now? And Karen just said, no, she's not here and she hasn't been here all evening. So immediately Patty started to panic because her daughter wasn't where she thought she was going to be and it was getting darker and darker outside, and so she just decided to contact the police department and report Elizabeth as missing. The Cole County Sheriff's Department was on the scene literally within 15 minutes and they straight away went to the neighbour's house, to Emma's house. However, just like Emma's grandmother said, Elizabeth wasn't there and she hadn't been there at all that evening. Emma was there, but Elizabeth wasn't, so where was she? So the police conducted a search for 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten and they called in to help with the search the local fire department and more police officers, and also they just had volunteers, just normal people coming to help search for this little girl. And by about 10 p.m. that evening, there were literally hundreds of people out looking for Elizabeth. So the police formed a grid search area around Elizabeth's house and the neighbours' houses because they figured wherever she was at this point, she couldn't have gotten that far. However, as the night went on, there was still no sign of her. And obviously you can't even imagine how Elizabeth's mother, Patty, would have been feeling. Every second without her daughter probably felt like an hour. She was so frantic and so scared, but the police just kept telling her that there was no indication that foul play was involved in her daughter's disappearance. I think that at this point the police just thought that Elizabeth had probably just wandered off on her own and just gotten lost somewhere, but Patty was convinced that something more sinister had happened to her daughter because she's a 9-year-old girl that is terrified of the dark. She wouldn't just not come home by choice. Patty had also been constantly ringing Elizabeth's phone because she did have a phone with her. She did take a phone with her that night. However, every single time that Patty rang it, it would just go straight to voicemail. But the fact that she did have her phone on her meant that the police had the possibility of tracking her through that. And so they contacted the cell phone company that Elizabeth's phone was from, and they ordered an emergency ping. And basically this emergency ping allows the police to receive signals from the phone and show them where the nearest cell tower is, like which cell tower the phone is closest to. So this data was gathered, and using it, the detectives tried to find the precise location of Elizabeth's cell phone. And it did work. There were a total of 3 emergency pings, all of which indicated that Elizabeth's phone was in the general area of the woods nearby. Basically, behind 6-year-old Emma's house, Emma was that friend, if you remember, that asked Elizabeth to come out and play that evening. Behind her house, there was a wooded area. But the problem was this wooded area was very large, and the ping from Elizabeth's phone just indicated around the general area of the woods. It was a huge, thick, forested area, and there was a lot of it to cover, and so it wasn't going to be easy searching this entire woods quickly, and the investigators realized that they needed more help with this. They needed backup. And so even more police officers were brought in to help search this wooded area the following day. This search for Elizabeth was massive. The police had helicopters flying around to get a better view from above. There were sniffer dogs. They brought in dive teams to search the local ponds and rivers. There were also hundreds of volunteers joining the search. Everything that they could have possibly done to find Elizabeth, they did. Elizabeth's missing person report was also sent out to the neighbouring law enforcement agencies and the FBI so that literally everyone knew to look out for this little girl. The police also tracked down local sex offenders because they were concerned that maybe Elizabeth had been kidnapped by a paedophile in the area. But by Thursday afternoon, it had been almost 24 hours since Elizabeth Olten was last seen, and that is a very long amount of time for a child to be missing. It wasn't looking good. So whilst all of these manual searches of the wooded area were going on, the investigators decided to go and speak to that 6-year-old little girl named Emma, who was the last person to see Elizabeth before she vanished. Now, I believe that initially when the police first spoke to Emma, she said that her and Elizabeth were playing together for about an hour, and then Elizabeth began walking home, and that was the last time that she saw her. But then after a while, 6-year-old Emma began kind of changing and adding to her story, and she said that whilst her and Elizabeth were out playing that evening, she actually got stuck in some thorn bushes. Emma got stuck in the thorn bushes, and so obviously it was painful, and she was crying and screaming for her older sister Alyssa to come and help her get out of this bush, which she did. Now, Alyssa, whose full name was Alyssa Bustamante, she was 15 years old at the time of this case taking place, and like I said, she was Emma's older half-sister. And Alyssa and Emma also had 2 twin half-brothers, so in total there were 4 siblings. And these 4 siblings all lived with their grandmother. I think they may have also lived with a grandfather, but I couldn't find his name. I could only find the name of the grandmother. She was called Karen Brooke, and she was their legal guardian. And the Bustamante children and the Olten children, so Elizabeth and her 2 siblings and Alyssa and her 3 siblings, were all very friendly with each other. Obviously they were all neighbours, and so they would play with each other quite often. And as the detectives were looking into the neighbourhood children and figuring out where each of them were at the time that Elizabeth went missing, they found that every single child in the neighbourhood was accounted for, apart from one. 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante. So the police decided to speak to Alyssa, and she told them that she actually skipped school that day and that she was aware that Elizabeth had gone missing, but she herself didn't know anything about it. She didn't know where she was or what happened to her. And the police noted that when they were speaking to her, she was very forthcoming and very calm, and so they weren't really suspicious of her. And whilst Alyssa was being interviewed by the detectives, other police officers and volunteers were obviously still searching the wooded area, the woods behind the Bustamante home. And eventually, some of the volunteers stumbled upon what they believed looked like a shallow grave in the backwoods. And obviously, they're looking for a 9-year-old little girl, and they stumble across what looks like a shallow grave. So they were immediately concerned, and they told the investigators what they had found. So investigators began just looking around this shallow grave, this hole. I don't think that they dug it up straight away, because obviously this could be a potential crime scene, so they had to be careful not to disturb any forensic evidence that could have been there. And I don't actually know why, but eventually the FBI agents that were speaking to Alyssa Bustamante brought her to this shallow grave, this hole in the ground. Like I said, I don't actually know why they decided to bring her to this shallow grave. Maybe it was because they wanted her to retrace her steps, because obviously her younger sister Emma said that Alyssa had been there with her and Elizabeth when she got stuck in the thorn bush. Anyway, they brought her to this hole in the ground. By the way, when I say hole, I don't actually mean a hole. It looked like someone had dug a grave-shaped hole there recently and then filled it back in with soil. But they brought Alyssa to this grave-shaped hole in the ground, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she turns to one of the detectives and she says, "Oh, I dug that hole." And so the detectives asked her why, and she said, quote, "I just like digging holes." She also said that she enjoyed burying dead animals. So like when she came across a dead animal in the woods, she would dig holes for them, she would dig a grave for them and bury them. But anyway, this shallow grave that Alyssa made was eventually dug up, and there was nothing in there. But the police were still suspicious of her, and at this point it had been almost 48 hours since Elizabeth Olten was last seen. And so because the detectives were a little bit suspicious of Alyssa, they decided that they wanted to get a search warrant to search her home, just to see if they could find anything there that could indicate if Alyssa had anything to do with Elizabeth's disappearance. The detectives managed to obtain consent to search the home, and I think they were searching the whole house, but they were also focusing a lot on Alyssa's bedroom. So there was one evidence agent assigned to search Alyssa's room, and as soon as she walked into it, she described it as spine chilling. She said that there were several things that she came across in Alyssa's bedroom that were disturbing, which I'm going to run through now. The first thing that the agent noticed when she walked into Alyssa's bedroom was there was a lot of drawings and writing on her walls. Now, some of this was written in pen, but it was later found that some of it was written in blood. On one of her walls, Alyssa had written a poem about self-harm and cutting, and one of the lines in this poem read, "I cut to see blood because I like it." On another wall in Alyssa's room, there was a drawing of a person that appeared to have slash-style markings on the head and arms, and next to this drawing, Alyssa had written the name Emma. So we can assume that this drawing of this person was of Alyssa's 6-year-old half-sister. But before I tell you what else was found in her room, I just want to give you a little bit more background information on 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante. So like I mentioned earlier, Alyssa and her 3 siblings all lived with their grandmother Karen, and she had done since the year 2002. So when Alyssa was about 8 years old, I believe she started living with her grandmother. And the reason that she lived with her grandmother and not her parents was because her mother was constantly on and off drugs. She was a drug addict, and so she was in no fit state to look after her children. And Alyssa's father, whose name was Caesar, was actually in prison, and according to sources online, he was serving a long prison sentence. Although I don't actually know the exact reason why. I did read on one source that it was for assault, which is probably accurate because from what I could gather online, he was a very violent man. But yeah, he was in prison. He was serving a long sentence, probably for assault. And although he was in prison, Alyssa was still in contact with her father. I don't know how regular this contact was, but he would write to her from prison, and she would tape these letters that he had written to her on her bedroom walls. According to sources online, Alyssa was actually a really good student in school. She typically got like A and B grades, and from what I can gather, her legal guardians, her grandparents, were very caring people, and they looked after Alyssa and her siblings really well. Now, Alyssa struggled a lot with her mental health. She struggled with self-harm and with suicidal thoughts, and she had attempted suicide on a few occasions. And her former best friend Jennifer did notice the self-harm scars on Alyssa's arm. In fact, Alyssa would actually show her friends her scars on her arms, and I think that Jennifer did try to talk to her about it and be there for her and support her friend. In the year 2007, so 2 years before this case took place, after one of Alyssa's suicide attempts, she was put into a psychiatric hospital for 10 days, and following this she was put on a strong prescription for antidepressants. Also, later on in this case, a YouTube video that Alyssa had filmed and uploaded surfaced and was brought to the police's attention. Now, this video that Alyssa had filmed and uploaded to YouTube was of her 2 twin brothers, and she was behind the camera encouraging them to touch this electric fence. And on the screen, while she's trying to encourage them to touch this electric fence, she writes the words, "This is where it gets good. We get to see my brothers get hurt." This is her 2 younger brothers, and she wants them to hurt themselves by touching an electric fence. Also, on her YouTube and MySpace page, under the hobby section, she listed hers as being, quote, "killing people and cutting." Her friend Jennifer also said that at her own 15th birthday party, Alyssa said, quote, "I just wonder what it would be like to just kill someone, to see the life just drain out of someone. I wonder what it would feel like, that type of power, to take that away from someone." Alyssa clearly had some sort of fascination with murder and death and hurting people. But anyway, going back to where we were before in the case, so the evidence agents were still going through Alyssa's room, and they were finding all of these disturbing things like the drawings and writings on the wall in blood. And then they came across probably the most disturbing thing in this case. It was Alyssa's journal. And some of the things that Alyssa had written in her journal were very alarming. In one of her entries, she talked about burning down a house and killing all of the people inside. And this is a 15-year-old girl writing this stuff. She's writing in her journal about how she wants to burn a house down with people inside. In another entry that was written just 1 week before Elizabeth disappeared, Alyssa wrote, quote, "If I don't talk about it, I bottle it up, and when I explode, someone's gonna die." So the agents continued reading this journal, and when they got to the last page, the last entry, they found that it was written on October the 21st, 2009, the day that 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten disappeared. However, Alyssa had actually used a blue pen and scribbled over her entry from that day so that it couldn't be read, and obviously that looks very suspicious. It just seems very odd that she would scribble out the diary entry from the day that Elizabeth disappeared. She clearly didn't want anyone or detectives reading what she had written. But why? The only part of this diary entry that wasn't scribbled out was, of course, the date, and also the very last bit, which just said, quote, "Now I've got to go to church, lol." So the journal was taken by the agents as potential evidence, and the following morning, Alyssa was brought into the police station once again for an interview with Sergeant David Rice. However, just before David goes into the room where Alyssa is, just before he goes to interview her, he looks at the last entry in Alyssa's journal. Like I said, she had scribbled over the writing from the day that Elizabeth disappeared. However, using backlighting, so by holding a light under the paper, David Rice was able to make out 2 words from that day's entry, and those 2 words were slit and throat. Eventually, Detective Rice goes into the interrogation room and he begins speaking to 15-year-old Alyssa, and as the interview goes on, he could tell that she was getting more and more nervous. She was very quiet, she began to quiver and her head would shake. She was just getting more and more uncomfortable, and they knew why. It was because she was so scared that they knew what she had done. And then just as the detective for Alyssa was about to break, he got out her journal and he says to her, quote, "We have your diary and we've read your diary, even the last entry which was scribbled out." And as soon as he says that, Alyssa just cracks, and she finally decided to tell the detectives what happened to Elizabeth Olten. Well, kind of. Alyssa's initial version of events was that on the evening of Elizabeth's disappearance, the two were walking through the woods together when suddenly Elizabeth accidentally fell, hit her head, and just died. So she was trying to claim that Elizabeth's death was an accident. However, of course, the detectives didn't believe her because they had read her diary and it was clear that she had some sort of fascination with murdering people. So they did not believe for 1 second this was an accident. And so the detectives just said to Alyssa, look, when we recover Elizabeth's body, it will be sent for an autopsy, which means we will be able to figure out her exact cause of death. So if you are lying about how she really died, then we will know. And so the detectives just asked Alyssa straight up, was Elizabeth's throat cut? Because if you remember, the 2 words that they could read in her diary entry from that day using backlighting were slit and throat. And so the detectives believed that this was one of the injuries Elizabeth would have sustained. And when the detectives asked her this, asked Alyssa if Elizabeth's throat was cut, she just said yes. So this clearly wasn't an accident. Now, at the time in the interrogation room with Alyssa was her grandmother, Karen, and when Alyssa said that Elizabeth's throat was cut, her grandmother just completely broke down in tears. She was distraught, as you can imagine, and so she left the room. And once she had, Alyssa Bustamante began to confess to the murder of 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten. Alyssa told the detectives that that evening, the evening that Elizabeth disappeared, she told her younger half-sister Emma to go to Elizabeth's house and get her to come out and play with her, which, as we know, she did. So Emma took Elizabeth to Alyssa, and at this point Alyssa told her little sister to go home, leaving her alone with Elizabeth. She then took Elizabeth's hand and began walking her into the woods behind her house. They walked for around 15 minutes, about a quarter mile into the woods, and this whole time Alyssa was saying to Elizabeth, I want to show you something. I've got something to show you in the woods. It's just a little bit further. So she is walking with this little girl for 15 minutes, knowing exactly what she is about to do to her, and not at any point does she decide to stop and just take Elizabeth back home. Now, Alyssa was also armed with a kitchen knife, and she was leading Elizabeth to a pre-dug grave that she had made. So this just shows you how planned this murder was. This was never a spur-of-the-moment decision. Alyssa had carefully planned this murder. She had even dug Elizabeth's grave beforehand. And once the two of them got to this pre-dug hole, Alyssa began strangling 9-year-old Elizabeth, and she was facing her at the time, so she was watching this 9-year-old girl struggling to breathe. She said that she strangled Elizabeth multiple times, and then she got out the kitchen knife and began stabbing her mainly in her chest area. And I believe she was stabbed about 7 times, and then Alyssa cut her throat. Once Elizabeth was dead, Alyssa said that she put her body in the pre-dug grave and buried her. So now the detectives had Alyssa's confession, but they still had not recovered Elizabeth's body. Obviously, earlier on in the investigation, they did find a shallow grave or a hole that Alyssa had admitted to making, but that wasn't the one where she buried Elizabeth. And like I mentioned earlier, this forest area was huge. So it was going to be really difficult to search the area and find the body unless Alyssa showed them where it was. And that's exactly what she did. She agreed to take detectives to Elizabeth's body, and this wasn't difficult for her at all. She remembered exactly where it was, and she took them straight to the burial site. Now, Alyssa hadn't actually buried the body that deep, and it wasn't very well covered. I believe it was covered in some leaves, and the detectives could just see that Elizabeth's body was literally only a few inches under the ground, and some of her body parts were actually sticking out of the mud. So Elizabeth's body was recovered and it was taken for an autopsy, which confirmed that the injuries Alyssa had told them about and the injuries that she had written about in her diary were in fact the injuries that were present on Elizabeth's body. And speaking of the diary, the detectives at this point had used a blue light to finally uncover what Alyssa had written in her last diary entry before she scribbled over it with a blue pen. So obviously before, the only thing the detectives could see were the words, "Now I've got to go to church, lol," and "slit and throat." And now they had uncovered that whole piece of text. After Alyssa had committed the murder, she wrote in her journal that same day, quote, "I just fucking killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel at the moment. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the oh my god, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kind of nervous and shaky though right now. K, I gotta go to church now, lol." And I just find that last part so chilling. She's literally writing about how she just murdered a 9-year-old girl, and then at the end she puts, "K, I gotta go to church now, lol." She doesn't display any remorse or guilt about what she's just done. In fact, she says that it was amazing and enjoyable. The detectives also found out that she had dug Elizabeth's grave at least 5 days before she murdered her. So we know that at the very least she was planning this for 5 days, but it was probably a lot longer than that. So now the detectives had more than enough evidence against Alyssa Bustamante, including her confession. They had enough to charge her with first-degree murder. And despite the fact that she was only 15 years old at the time that she murdered Elizabeth, she was certified to stand trial as an adult, and she was charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree and for armed criminal action because she carried and used a knife in the murder. Now, it wouldn't be till a couple of years later, when Alyssa was 18 years old in 2012, that she was actually sentenced. She eventually pled guilty, and her lawyers were trying to get her the lightest sentence possible because they argued that she was mentally unstable at the time of the murder. They said that the fact that she suffered with self-harm and the fact that she was taking strong antidepressants at the time may have triggered violent impulses resulting in the death of Elizabeth. So they essentially said that this strong medication that Alyssa was taking sometimes triggered something in her and made her act on these violent impulses. And on this particular day, this violent impulse resulted in the death of Elizabeth. Whereas the prosecution argued that this murder was not done on impulse. This was not a spur of the moment thing. This was a hugely premeditated crime. She dug Elizabeth's grave at least 5 days before her murder. She wrote in her journal about wanting to kill someone. She told her friends that she wanted to kill someone. She sent her younger sister to fetch her victim, and then she walked her victim for 15 minutes to her grave. Ultimately, Alyssa Bustamante was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole and an additional 30 years for armed criminal action. Under Missouri law, she will serve 35 years and 5 months before she will be eligible for parole, so she could be released one day. Her lawyers did appeal against her sentence, however, this appeal was denied in 2014. And that is the end of this case, a really crazy one. Please do let me know what you guys think about this case in the comments and let me know your opinions. I feel like it's quite a controversial one because when I was doing my research for this case, I obviously came across some people's opinions and they were quite mixed. Some people thought that Alyssa's sentence was too harsh given her mental state at the time of the murder, and other people disagreed and thought that she should have been given more time. So please do let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments. As always though, do be respectful of other people's opinions. But yeah, that is it for this video. Before I go, I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, the link is always in the description of my videos. Please do give this video a thumbs up and remember to subscribe, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye guys.